Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno and Horkheimer. Today we're gonna read the second section of the chapter, the culture industry, and this section opens with what the culture industry does to leisure. Now, leisure means your free time. It's the time that you get once you finish your work or chores. So normally that is the time in which people leave the industry, where workers don't have to submit to their boss's plans anymore, or when students don't have to listen to their teachers or do homeworks, for example. So leisure is supposed to be the opposite of work, and as such it cannot be integrated within work. But as we will see, the culture industry, through its totalizing nature, cannot let leisure be leisure, because what people do in their leisure time cannot be independent of the process of production, meaning of work. Like the system needs to keep track of people's movements and actions in that time, because if it doesn't, well, people can use that time to cultivate their minds and start making demands. So leisure needs to be controlled and integrated within the system. It must be a continuation or an extension of work and not the opposite of work. So in short, even during their leisure time, consumers must orient themselves according to the unity of production. So leisure must therefore be utilized and instrumentalized for the maintenance of the system's unity. So leisure, which is, the most intimate time for individuals, because that's when technically you can be yourself, you can do what you want to do and what you couldn't do in the workplace, for example. So leisure is supposed to be, the moment to escape standardization, but we will see that that's not the case, and that leisure is actually used in such a way that it makes standardization even more potent. And this starts with a reference to Immanuel Kant. Quote, "The active contribution which Kantian schematism still expected of subjects, that they should from the start relate sensuous multiplicity to fundamental concepts, is denied to the subject by industry. It pervades schematism as its first service to the customer." So we need to explain what is schematism to understand that quote, and we need to talk a little bit about Kant. So during the Enlightenment, there were two big schools of thought clashing with each other. You had the rationalists and then you had the empiricists. Now, Kant sided more with the empiricists. He has this famous phrase about David Hume. He said David Hume was the empiricist by excellence, and Kant said that David Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. But he doesn't really, go all the way with empiricism, because he doesn't want to fall into radical skepticism, and this is where his schematism is going to play an important role. Now, the problem of empiricism is that it challenges the rationalists' claim that concepts are eternal, that they are outside of time and space, and that they are, general, universal. So empiricists, by postulating that everything comes to us through our senses, means that concepts are not like that they are particular and temporal. Like concepts for the empiricists, they are created by the mind due to the input that we receive through the senses at a given time and a given place. So each mind makes its own concepts. Okay, concepts are products of particular minds, and so they are not really, general or universal like, the rationalists would say. And so with this, we can even conclude that science itself is reduced to simple sets of beliefs, and this is what the rationalists are trying to avoid. By positing that concepts do exist and that we can apprehend them through the mind, rationalists would argue that we can reach some certainty about reality. But since there is this clash between rationalist and empiricist, well, Kant is going to try to save both, and this is where his schematism comes in, because he says that both rationalists and empiricists were looking at the problem in the wrong way. And the problem was precisely because they were just looking. For them, knowledge was an issue of contemplation. You just, look at knowledge, whereas for Kant, knowledge is about an action. It's about a praxis. Like the rationalists and the empiricists basically say that there are things, and the mind is contemplating them. For the rationalists, it is concepts, and for the empiricist, it is appearances or sensations. And so, for example, you take a triangle. For the rationalists, it is a concept. It is a form that is always valid. Like a triangle will always have 3 sides, and the sum of its angles will always make 180 degrees. But for the empiricists, they say that the triangle is an image that the mind generated from the input that it receives from the senses in a certain context. Had that context been different, maybe we wouldn't think of triangles or give them that definition. So it is a particular representation. So Kant is going to argue that the triangle is not an image. We're not looking at an image, but we are making something. We are doing a praxis. It is the triangle is actually a method of constructing triangles. Triangles can be right triangles. They can be equilateral, isosceles. I think that's how it is pronounced in English, isocel, when it has 2 equal sides, but not all 3. So the triangle itself is actually a schema. It is, if you want, a model, a form that I can follow in order to make all sorts of other triangles. So the triangle is actually the consequence of actions that I do in order to draw a triangle. So it's like, you have a rule, okay, 3 sides and 180 degrees, and that rule is an abstract rule. And for Kant, we can say that it is universal, but then you have the schema, which is the operation that materializes that rule. So a schema is a rule that you put in practice. So, for example, when you play football or basketball, you have the rules of the game, but then you have the actual game. And so when you watch a game, you actually see the schema unfold through the actions of the players. And what this means is that our sensory experience is like a football game. When you see a bottle of water, what I am seeing is a praxis that my mind is creating by applying a rule that is, according to Kant, and this is his rationalist side, is innate in us. Like the rules are innate in us, we are born with them, we are not blank slates like the empiricists argue, but we come into being with innate categories that are into our minds, and those categories will allow us to create the world around us. So schematism basically means that you are applying the categories in your mind to construct the world around you. So everything that you see, hear, touch, or smell is a praxis of a category within the mind. But since each mind is particular, each sensory experience would be unique. Now for Kant, the categories are universal and are put there by God, but he left room for each individual to apply that praxis in their own way. And so this is what the authors are saying when they appeal to Kant, that the subjects should from the start relate their sensory experiences to fundamental concepts. It means that each individual see their own perception and experience as the praxis of their own mind, and that can be interpreted as seeing the world through their own individuality, since each mind is particular. So if you look at the world through your own mind, through your own categories, then you are looking at the world through your own individuality. So each person has their own schemes, if you want, and knowledge is about reflecting on your actions in order to know those concepts in your mind. This is what makes it critical. It's that you see what you are creating, what your mind is creating, and so knowledge is about understanding why your mind is creating those things. It's reflecting on the schemas that you are applying. And so this is supposed to be done during the time of leisure. In time of leisure, that's when you can reflect on your mind, on how your mind is working, and that is what what we mean by, you know, people can be themselves. It means that, you know, they become conscious of who they are. You know, this is what we also mean by knowing yourself. It's about, you know, knowing how your mind is creating the world around you. But the culture industry is going to shortcut this process, and so it doesn't allow people to know themselves, to be conscious of their own schemas. Instead, the culture industry wants everyone to adopt its own praxis, the praxis of the culture industry. It wants to be the one in charge of the categories, the fundamental concepts to which we relate our sensory experience. So, in other words, the culture industry wants to be God who puts in your head, in your mind, the categories that you are, you know, going to apply in order to construct the world around you. And so that way the culture industry makes us see, it makes sure, first of all, that we will always see what it wants us to see, that we will hear what the culture industry wants us to hear, smell what it wants us to smell, taste and touch what it wants us to smell and touch, etc. So all sensory experience only makes sense as long as they obey the desires of the culture industry. Just like men, for example, when they see women, they must see them as submissive baby makers, and that's, you know, how the patriarchy puts, you know, these categories into the minds of men, for example, so that every time they see a woman, they just construct a woman based on the categories that the patriarchy, you know, puts in their mind. The same thing is going to apply to customers. Customers must see their needs in the product that the companies sell them. And as such, the schematism of the culture industry is itself the primordial service to the customer. We tell the customer what they should desire, right? So the culture industry is actually, you know, going to put in you the desires that it wants you to have. And so this feat of the culture industry is done through the obsession with psychological studies that were growing at the time. Like whereas Kant left some mystery about our psychology, about how the mind functions, psychology as a science claimed to have cracked the code. It now knows how the mind works and can therefore exploit the mind's mechanisms to make it see what it wants the mind to see. Quote, according to Kantian schematism, a secret mechanism within the psyche preformed immediate data to fit them into the system of pure reason. That secret has now been unraveled. So when we take data, like when you have data coming in the psyche, into the mind, there has to be, you know, a secret mechanism prior to that data that can make sense of that data. And so once that secret mechanism is understood or revealed, the culture industry can do whatever it wants with the subject. And so basically the culture industry creates a form of matrix in which the subjects just take on everything thrown at them passively. And so in this sense, the idea that it is the needs of the customer isn't all wrong, since the subjects themselves are compliant with the status quo. And so the planning that the culture industry is exploiting isn't much, you know, the work of the industry itself, as also that of the passivity and the inertia of an irrational society that puts faith in an abstract system. That is, you know, an abstract, you know, systematic rationality, let's say. Like people no longer think, since they have given thought to machines, to algorithms, to customer surveys, to statistics, and to data. You know, it's the numbers that do the thinking, not the subjects. And so all the business agencies have to do is just to pluck those numbers and turn them into products to sell. And so even the ideals of science, of classification, no longer matter, really. People no longer bother to even, you know, do the slightest classification at this point. Quote, for the customer, there is nothing left to classify, since the classification has already been preempted by the schematism of production. So what this means is that the processes of production have decided in advance what is there to classify in the world. Anything else that doesn't fit into that process is a delusion, or anything that doesn't contribute to that process is a delusion, something that cannot exist, so we don't have any need to talk about it or to think about it. And this can be weird when you think about it. Like, people seem no longer wanting to think about alternatives to whatever is presented to them by the culture industry. It's like they live in the end of history, where everything has been figured out. Like, dreams or imagination in this state is seen as a complete fantasy, right? But what is funny is that it is the world created by the culture industry that fits all of the boxes of fantasy. Adorno and Horkheimer have this paradoxical way of putting it. They say this dreamless art for the people fulfills the dreamy idealism, which went too far for idealism in its critical form. Everything comes from consciousness, from that of God for Malebranche and Berkeley, and from earthly production management for mass art. So the dreamless art, the fact that we don't dream anymore, creates the dream of idealism. Now, idealism is the belief that everything is just ideas. There is no material world. Everything that we see is a manifestation of an idea. But these ideas, in order for them to be ideas, must be the product of a mind, of a certain consciousness. So for the idealists that Adorno and Horkheimer mention, Malebranche and Berkeley, that consciousness is God. There is only God, and he is just contemplating the ideas of his own mind. And we are those ideas. The material world is just the ideas of God. So what this implies is that there is only one thing that produces everything. From the mind of God, everything is created. And this idealism, the reason why Marxists don't like it is because it alienates people from their labor, or of their own ideas. Even people cannot be masters of their fate. They cannot have ideas of their own or imagine alternative worlds, since they are not in charge, since there cannot be anything else but whatever this God mind decides upon. So Marxists revert the hierarchy and say that the world isn't the product of ideas, but ideas are the product of the world. And therefore idealism itself is an idea that some people, giving their conditions of existence, have produced. It's the bourgeoisie that would invent such ideas, that the material world doesn't exist and everything is produced by this God mind, because, well, they don't work in the fields. The bourgeoisie, the bourgeois individuals don't work in the field. They don't transform the material world, and so for them the material world doesn't really exist. And we already mentioned this when we talked about the master-slave dialectics, when we mentioned Hegel. So hence, Marxism has to be an atheist philosophy to negate this idealism and allow people to be free and in control of their labor. But as Adorno and Horkheimer suggest, the positivism that resulted from Enlightenment, by throwing away idealism, and by the same occasion people's artful dreams, only realized the dreams of idealism. Like, when we get rid of idealism, Adorno and Horkheimer, they say that because technically Enlightenment should be opposed to idealism, but when we threw away idealism to privilege reason, well, what we did was actually create the ideal state. We realized the utopia of idealism. Now we don't have divine consciousness running the show, but we have an earthly production management of the mass art. Now, mass art, which is what we consume in movies, songs, radios, magazines, etc., they become the new ideas of the new god of the 20th century, the culture industry. And so they all obey the praxis of this earthly mind, let's say. The culture industry is a consciousness that has its own categories, its own schemas, its own praxis, like God and his ideas. And so in idealism, the world is the praxis of God's ideas, and likewise now everything we see is the praxis of the culture industry's ideas. So everything that seems different, the variant elements in movies and songs, soap operas, etc., are actually all the product of the same praxis, of the same mind. So in other words, the culture industry is about the production of cliches. All details are interchangeable. as they say. The details in one movie can be, substituted to another movie without, noticing any difference. So all tropes, archetypes, storylines, catchy music, characters, etc., all of them are, as they say, quote, like all the details, ready-made cliches to be used here and there as desired and always completely defined by the purpose they serve within the schema. To confirm the schema by acting as its constituents is their sole raison d'être. So, when you watch a movie and you kind of know what is coming, like you even get to the point where you expect a plot twist, when you just, feel that there are elements that all movies have to have, and it just makes the whole thing cliche. Like there is no room for novelty anymore, and it's like, we just do a movie for the sake of, for the sake of the schema, just to reproduce a formula of movies, rather than, making art that would emancipate or propose, alternative ways of being and existing. It's like the production is more concerned with the process, with making the movie, than the movie itself. It's more like concerned with if the movie is going to check all the boxes required by the culture industry than about making a good movie, for example. So artists become simple technicians that make sure that everything is going smoothly according to the demands of the culture industry. So the role of a technician is simply to make sure that the engine is working fine. And so we don't hire a technician for a plane or train to talk about beauty or ideas, but simply to make sure that the plane flies and the train, won't derail. So it makes sense for trains and planes, but when we come to works of art, making sure that the movie works, that it will hit the box office, regardless of the beauty of its structure or details of its philosophical content, all of this seems like we're not doing what we are supposed to be doing, right? Like it's two different fields that are removed from one another, like when it comes to planes and trains, the emphasis is going to be on whether the machine works, because if it doesn't, well, people die. But when it comes to art, that the art works well is not shouldn't really be the priority, but rather the art should be maybe beautiful, or the art should be thought-provoking, etc. So since these are two different fields, why are we applying the same principle for them? And so the culture industry, like the technician, it likes the technician simply because it focuses on efficiency. The engine runs, the movie contains effects. When movies try so much to make you feel something, or that they put everything on special effects, hoping that people won't notice that the plot doesn't make any sense. Well, this is what we are talking about. Quote, the culture industry has developed in conjunction with the predominance of the effect, the tangible performance, the technical detail over the work, which once carried the idea and was liquidated with it. So we focus on effects, we focus on technical details, tangible performances, but the work, we don't care about it. And by forgetting about the work, we also forget about the ideas that the work was carrying. And so again, we are taught to look at movies like, producers. What matters is that it's a film, not what the film was conveying or saying. We don't care if the film has organic connection between its elements. We don't care if an effect or detail adds more beauty to a scene, or makes it, or makes its meaning ambiguous, or offers new interpretations, etc. We just care about, if the movie works, if it's going to be a hit at the box office. But this doesn't mean that the culture industry is about applying strict and rigid rules. Like when you make a movie, it has to stick to traditional storyline, or it must follow an Aristotelian framework, for example. You can go wild with movies in the culture industry. So don't go thinking that simply because you transgress some rules, that makes you a rebel in the face of the industry. The industry does the same. But the point of the industry is to make the detail and the whole indistinguishable from one another. It is to It is not to stick to rigid rules at all. Like the authors use modern art from Romanticism to Expressionism to make their point. They say that in modern art you have an emancipation of details, like details don't have to be trapped within a general structure. So the model of Aristotle, for example, limits storytelling to just a chronological development of an action, like there is a beginning, a middle, a climax, and then there is the ending. Here, every detail has only the job of bringing about the next phase of the story. But with Romanticism, however, details don't have to be limited to that function. Some can be purely aesthetic, others can make a minor character more complex and attractive than the main character, or maybe, you know, details aren't much about the story as they are about emotions, for example. You know, when there are movies that have no plot, there is no story, but it's just a bunch of people that we come to know and just share their emotions or experiences, or it can be, you know, about experience itself, not the expression of an emotion, but just expression itself. And as such, you know, romantic art is an art that is opposed to organization. It's not necessarily after a coherent or cohesive whole, but exploring, you know, different ways of experience and expression. And so the details can break free from the whole and they become more imposing than that whole. Adorno and Horkheimer give the example of music, where sometimes a note can make us forget about the whole, or how a piece in a long music performance can overshadow the whole composition, or when in painting, for example, a detail obscures the whole painting. In a novel, it's the psychology of a character that just, you know, obliterates the whole structure of the story, etc. The culture industry is actually trying to stop. It doesn't want details to be free from totality. It sure can do it by trapping the details within rigid rules and structures, but it usually does it by making it impossible to distinguish the whole from the details, like for example in jazz, or at least how Adorno sees jazz. What jazz does is precisely it liberates even more the details, and this, you know, for the authors, it's actually another way for trapping the details within, you know, the oppressive structure. Like in jazz, you do have a challenge to traditional structures, and it's all based on improvisation. But when each note is interrupted, when it goes to all directions, like it goes into all directions randomly and systematically in all directions, you just cannot distinguish the notes anymore. Like each note obeys the same principle, after all, just obeys improvisation. And so the end result is that what is producing the detail is the same principle that produces the whole. And so in the previous examples, the details are freed from totality, but they maintain their own individuality because they are the product of spontaneity, the product of work, not of a formula. Jazz, on the other hand, jazz unruliness is directed by a formula that repeats itself in every single note. So both the entire composition and its effects are made by the same formula. So this is what they mean by, you know, the culture industry can transgress rules, but its transgression is also going to be a formula. So both whole and part becomes indistinguishable. As they write, through totality, the culture industry is putting an end to all of that. Although operating only with effects, it subdues their unruliness and subordinates them to the formula which supplants the work. It crushes equally the whole and the parts. And so they illustrate this with a successful man's career whose success is just a series of idiotic events. Like, you know, it's something made out of luck or by machines. Like when someone gets successful, but he didn't work on each event, like he didn't work on each event that led to his success. He was just, you know, handed that success either by luck or because, you know, some machine, an AI, for example, did the job for him. It's like when a teacher knows that you didn't do the homework, that the essay was written by an AI, by ChatGPT, because they can recognize a mechanical work from an organic work. Like yeah, this one was made by a machine, but this one was made by, for example, Ismail, not by any human being, but by a human being in particular. And so this isn't because one lacks style or anything like that. Later on in the section, they argue that the culture industry exhausts neither the energy to produce art nor the use of style. As a matter of fact, many people who have a boner for high culture identify the problem with people no longer having artistic energy or no longer care about, rules of style. This is your average teacher who is complaining that no one writes like Shakespeare or Baudelaire anymore. But this is a misunderstanding of how the culture industry operates. Like we deal with it like in a nostalgic way. We're like, things were better before. People produced real art before capitalism. We had a real culture. Like again, the culture industry is just doing all of that. Like it uses style, it has rigor, it uses rules, but it does it perfectly. And this is the real problem. Like the culture industry produces perfect paintings. It produces flawless composition where every single detail is actually at its place. In other words, there is no dissonance in what is produced by the culture industry. We can say that when we think of ChatGPT that there is a lot of mistakes in its answers, but it's not true. Like ChatGPT's answers are always aligned with its programming. The answers don't satisfy you, but they are perfect in relation to the task of the AI. They are flawless in terms of execution. And so in human work, however, there is dissonance. A poem by Shakespeare or Baudelaire is perfect in the sense that it has flaws, not that it is flawless. It is still a human production. It's still multifaceted. Like human beings have many different aspects, and those aspects clash with one another, and so that clash is supposed to be reflected in human work. But the culture industry wants to eliminate the flaws. This is why we say it liberates the details, but not really, because it makes the details fit more into a whole, because it makes it flawless. When the detail itself is flawless, you can no longer distinguish it from the whole. And so what this means is that the culture industry, by making everything perfect, it wants to eradicate all traces of difference. And it can do that with style. The problem is not a lack of style, as they write. No Palestrina could have eliminated the unprepared or unresolved dissonance more puristically than the jazz arranger excludes any phase which does not exactly fit the jargon. Now that's a reference to Giovanni Palestrina, an Italian composer of the Renaissance. He's compared to a jazz arranger in how the latter can make a product that is pure because he can exclude everything that doesn't fit into the jargon of jazz. Whereas, Palestrina can't exclude everything from his work, and therefore the difference is that in Palestrina there is a tension in the music, whereas with jazz there isn't, according to Adorno, of course. So everything is in complete harmony with everything in the culture industry, and that makes all the notes the same, like how Adorno understands jazz. So to jazz up Mozart, for example, is to change the music in a way to make every part of the composition exactly the same. It becomes simply monotonous. Like no detail can break free or be itself from the overall composition. No detail can escape the gaze of the industry, if you want. And so Adorno and Horkheimer give further examples, like how a patron during the Middle Ages, when he asks some artists to paint the windows of the cathedral, they couldn't be as imposing as studio producers and executives that want, to adopt a novel of Balzac or Victor Hugo to the screen. The medieval patron didn't have the power or the means to scrutinize every single detail in a painting or sculpture, whereas the culture industry has all the means to subjugate every work to this process. Like nothing can escape the gaze of the culture industry, whereas the gaze of a patron, well, because he is a human, well, he cannot have control over every single detail. So contrary to the patron in the culture industry, everything must conform to the demands of the culture industry. They write, no cathedral chapter could have assigned the grimaces and torments of the damned to their proper places in the order of divine love more scrupulously than production managers decide the position of the torture of the hero or the raised hem of the leading lady's dress within the litany of the big film. Now, this is a very interesting passage. Like, do you ever have this idea that can, this idea that can challenge belief in God when you just look at suffering? Like, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and is all love, why does he allow so much suffering to occur? This is the theory of gratuitous evil. Like, in a world where there is an all-loving God, no evil should be gratuitous. And as such, theologians always try to argue that whatever evil that happens in the world, it must be for a greater good somehow. Like, they try to force this suffering into the schema of belief. You have a belief that God is all love and you must love him back. So with that belief, that praxis must be a world where there is no evil. But you encounter evil, so there is something wrong with this belief. But then the theologian will try to make you see that the evil you just encounter is part of the belief. It's even further proof of God's divine love. Like, religion tries to assign the proper place of the suffering of the damned in the order of divine love. So we force suffering to fit into the idea of divine love somehow. And so we try to make this perfect. But whereas in religion you can still have an open window from the totalizing wish of belief. With the culture industry, however, that window is condemned. Like, when you watch a movie about a tormented hero, the torment is forced to fit into the litany of the big film. Litanies mean prayers in church services or processions recited by the clergy. Like, the film sanitizes the torment like belief does with suffering. It makes, the things that challenge established beliefs politically correct. The other example, the raised hem of the leading lady's dress, means when the female lead character has sex. Like with religion, sex can only occur in specific holy conditions. A woman or man cannot have sex just because they want to. They can only do that in a certain social framework sanctified by the church or by society. And so movies do that. They tell us when we can have sex with people, when it is okay for women to lift their dress up, in what circumstances, the sex is holy, and so we must be in love, or only after the guy who proved himself to be the right one, for example, because he sacrificed some dream or because he changed his ways. And he proved it by running to the airport to tell you that he really loves you. He told you his true feelings, etc. And so you cracked his shell, and now you can bang. Like, that's when you can have sex. So every detail must be controlled in this way. Like, nothing can escape from this process of putting things in their politically correct places. It's about deciding in advance what is tolerable, what is acceptable, and what isn't. Quote, the explicit and implicit, exoteric and esoteric catalog of what is forbidden and what is tolerated is so extensive that it not only defines the area left free, but wholly controls it. Even the most minor details are modeled according to this lexicon. So this is what we mean when we talk about cliches. That's how you can, distinguish between an essay written by a student and one by ChatGPT. One is just a bunch of cliches, because that's literally how ChatGPT works. It answers using the most cliche thing to say to say when you are asked, the question that you ask to the AI. And so a mechanical composition is one concerned with order rather than, with connection, let's say. The so-called leading idea is a filling compartment which creates order, not connections. Lacking both contrast and relatedness, the whole and the detail look alike. So by connection, we mean both connection between people and the work, but also the details among themselves and the whole. They maintain a connection like we've seen in magic, when we talked about magic in the concept of enlightenment. They can represent each other, but never replace one another. This means that the harmony of details and whole must never be guaranteed in advance. The point of having a representative is that there is a risk that the harmony between me and my representative is not guaranteed. And so the representative can never take my place because our differences matter. With AI, however, with the culture industry, the harmony is already guaranteed because everything will be the product of the same rhythm, even if the rhythm is chaotic, as long as it is the one as long as it is one rhythm repeated everywhere, it is harmonious in the mechanical way. Even if it is just a bunch of noise that make no sense, the fact that it is repeatable over and over again makes it still and rigid. So Adorno and Horkheimer even have a great analogy between art in the culture industry and democracy and tyranny. Like democracy is becoming a bunch of noise, so it seems like it's not rigid, and tyranny is thought to be rigid rules, like the Aristotelian traditional storytelling. But in reality, the stillness of tyranny can also be found, and even more potently so, in the lack of rules, in the bunch of random and chaotic noises. So Adorno and Horkheimer are basically saying that what we are presented with politically isn't really democracy but tyranny, and it is an idealism that went 100% rogue. And the funny thing about an idealism that goes 100% rogue is that it too becomes indistinguishable from its often taken to be counterpart, that is realism. Realism means that the world exists independently of the mind, but as we've seen, the kind of realism we're talking about here is one that is more idealistic than idealism, since it's realism that is about perpetuating reproduction. Like realism is basically another formula trying to repeat itself indefinitely. In the context of film, and in the 30s and the 40s, there was an ongoing debate between theater and movies. Playwrights and stage actors felt their activity threatened with the arrival of cinema, because, well, cinema can do what theater always tried to do, which is reproducing reality. Quote, the familiar experience of the moviegoer who perceives the street outside as a continuation of the film he has just left, because the film seeks strictly to reproduce the world of everyday perception, has become the guideline of production. So movies are real in the sense that it is difficult to maintain some distance with them. It's very easy to confuse them with reality, in the sense, the distinction between fiction and reality is, blurred. Like cinema becomes the schema that builds reality, like the impression that what we see on the screen is so identical to our friends, parents, co-workers, our streets, etc. Makes it like whatever is shown to us must be what is shown to us, on the screen. It must be real. It must be a model to reenact once we leave the theater. Like whatever you do, whatever you see on the screen, whatever you see in movies, you are supposed to reproduce that in your real life. The movie becomes the schema for you. And just like in rituals, people relive their myths so that the myth continues to shape the world. People who go to the theater do the exact same thing. We may not believe that the characters we see in the movies actually exist, but we definitely reproduce the tropes. As they write, it creates the illusion that the world outside is a seamless extension of the one which has been revealed in the cinema. Film denies its audience any dimension in which they might roam freely in imagination. So, being an extension of the world beyond the screen, movies are simply spreading the idea that there is nothing to imagine anymore. Like realism, like we said, is like idealism in the sense that it suggests that there is nothing to think about anymore. Movies, and more specifically the sound film, unlike theater, doesn't allow any room for imagination. As you know, the first movies were silent movies in which you had a shot where someone talks, and then you move to a black screen with the lines of dialogue for the spectator to read. So there were, at least with silent films, cuts that make you keep a certain distance with the movie, where you can use imagination, or at least imagine how the character sounds, like their tone of voice, etc. But with the sound film, there is no opportunity for imagination. If you let your mind wander for a second, you may miss on an important information about the plot. You cannot even imagine anything about the scenes, perhaps the colors, but color films, were right around the corner. So the point of a movie is to hinder thought and imagination. Everything is already given to you. Images and sounds are already, there in front of you. And as we said, you cannot think about what you just saw, because all of your attention must be on the movie that keeps, throwing information at you. You must be, quick to observe and understand what is happening very, very quickly, like a machine computing data, or like when you try to listen to jazz. A note hits and is gone at the same time. And so deep thought requires time, but the culture industry wants you to always be in a hurry. Progress never waits, if you want. It's constantly moving, and it's forever constantly going, and people need to keep up with it. And so movies are conditioning you to have that behavior. Always be quick, never take your time, and always be alert. And so this technique proved so efficient that today no one can even stand watching a video that is longer than 10 minutes. The attention span is shrinking as a consequence of an industry that doesn't want people to afford to spend a lot of time thinking. And so everything must be consumed very quickly and very rapidly. And they got even to the point where people don't even consume consciously. Like the behavior favored by the culture industry it's a numbing consumerism, or a consumerist attitude. It's like a machine, and like you have to consume like automatically. As they say, the power of the industry of industrial society is imprinted on people once and for all. The products of the culture industry are such that they can be alertly consumed even in a state of distraction. So in other words, we become machines that power the machines of the culture industry. We are its cogs and its fuel, and as such, the system is totalizing because it's all there is. The culture industry turns the entire world with its people into one monist machinery, which, quote again, keeps everyone on their toes, both at work and in the leisure time, which resembles it. So work and leisure are now also the same thing. Like opposites are united into the machinery of economy. Again, this is what we mean by you make everything perfect. It's like you make everything, you make everything the same. So many times the authors use the term monopoly to refer to the unity of the system, but as we've already explained, monopoly is often associated with capitalism in the Marxist jargon, and as we explained, the authors want to keep some distance with classical Marxism. We explained in the afterword that the reason behind this is that Adorno and Horkheimer saw that the Marxist jargon got appropriated also by the culture industry, since the culture industry is about, sanitizing language, turning everything into cliches, into ready-made tropes to use automatically without any critical thought. It tries to turn, everything into political correctness. The language of Marxism too can become just cliches utilized to prevent critical thinking. What happened, according to them, is that Marxism is becoming totalitarian because whomever doesn't use its language must be, an ally of capitalism. So it closes all other alternative ways of thinking that is not aligned with its praxis. And so as a result, Marxism, which is supposed to be revolutionary, which is supposed to be, promoting the new, the different, etc., becomes itself like avant-garde art. It seeks the new, but only if the new strengthens the tradition it seeks to abolish. And so as such, avant-garde art may proclaim to be the opposite to the culture industry, may proclaim to be, opposed to cliches. It misunderstands the culture industry because it is using the same mechanisms that the culture industry uses, which means that, quote, like its adversary, avant-garde art, the culture industry defines its own language positively by means of prohibition applied to its syntax and vocabulary. Like here we have to say a few things about the philosophy of language. Like there's an idea in philosophy that argues that we think with words, and as such our language is going to determine our thought. So if someone doesn't like you to have a certain thought, I don't like you to have a certain thought, I will oblige you to use different words, or maybe create new rules to apply to the language so that it would structure the language in ways that would structure also the thought expressed by that language. Like there's an example from Frank Lepage. This is not in the text, but Frank Lepage is a contemporary popular educator, éducateur populaire in French. He's French. In one of his conferences, les conférences gesticulées, as he calls them, and you will find it in the description. He says, like he takes the example of the word exploité, which means exploited, and the word défavorisé, which means disadvantaged. And the word exploité, exploited, means that someone is being exploited by someone or something. So exploité means that there is an exploiteur, an exploiter. So there is someone that owes us an explanation here. But with the word défavorisé, it isn't a process but a state of being. Exploité is about a process. There is an entity causing the exploitation of someone, so it is a process. But in disadvantaged, défavorisé, there is no entity that is, purposefully causing it. So in French, for example, there is no word like défavoriseur, like exploiteur. There isn't someone doing the disadvantaging, if you want. There is no disadvantager. The word doesn't exist. So he uses the following example. Frank Lepage, he uses this following example. He says, imagine a woman. She's working class. She's a single mom. She has 2 kids, 2 jobs. If we refer to her as exploitée, it means someone or a system is purposefully exploiting her. But if she's défavorisée, then we are just saying that this woman is unlucky. Like no one is responsible for her situation. It's like, a natural accident or an act of God. So by preventing you from using certain words or certain rules, by saying that exploité is politically incorrect, for example, we can shape the way you conceive reality. So to define language positively means that you say that this is how you should talk, and these are the syntaxes and the vocabulary that you should avoid, right? And so basically we provide the cliches once we defined language positively. Again, cliches are basically tools at your disposal to shape reality like the culture industry wants you to shape it. And Adorno and Horkheimer are seeing this pattern everywhere, in jazz music, in avant-garde art, but also in Marxism as well, as the Stalinist experience was showing at that time. So everything is being stained with the pattern of the culture industry. Now jargon is used as a way to know if someone has the appropriate way of thinking, like language determines in advance who you are and where to classify or categorize you. Quote, every phenomenon is by now so thoroughly imprinted by the schema that nothing can occur that does not bear in advance the trace of the jargon that is not seen at first glance to be approved. But there is also something else about the example given by Lepage. When he gave that example, it was also to demonstrate that what is called the naturalisation of social relationships. In French, la naturalisation des rapports sociaux. And what that means is when you take social relationships and you try to make them appear as if they are natural. So the situation of the single mother isn't due to some social structure, to some hierarchy, and to unequal power distribution. No, it is due to nature. It is only natural that some people are more fortunate than others, that some earn more than others. So it is nature to blame, and of course no one can really blame nature. So the use of language needs to reflect this ideology. It must condition the users of the language to see their situation as the fruit of nature, not of social construction or social, relations. And so Marxism, paradoxically, can fall into this trap by applying the jargon without critical thought, or when the jargon is used in a monopolistic way. Quote, but the true masters, as both producers and reproducers, are those who speak the jargon with the same free and easy relish as if it were the language it has long since silenced. Such is the industry's ideal of naturalness. It asserts itself more imperiously the more the perfected technology reduces the tension between the culture product and everyday experience. So, the naturalness of the industry is that there is a use of language by the masters of the culture industry that is so fluent that it's almost like a machine speaking. It's like, the language is not even a language. Like, language means something cultural, something made by humans in a given situation to express a certain thought. But the silence of language here means that language becomes something completely natural. It's not a human creation, so to speak, but is something made by nature. So language loses its ideological pretensions here. It presents itself as if it is objective, free from ideological influence, free from power. And so language is presented as something that simply states facts, as a disinterested tool of expression and communication. When you state a fact, you are reproducing nature as it is. Telling it as it is means that you don't let your ideology or your animism or anthropomorphism intervene to distort the truth. See how many times I use brackets when I give the word facts, nature or logic or truth. That's because those words under the influence of the culture industry become themselves cliches. You feel that it is cliche whenever someone tries to justify something about the social world through it's natural, and you just cringe at it, right? So that's happening here. Language tries to unify everyday experience. Like we said with the example of divine love, it tries to remove the tension between the elements of society. Even the tension between nature and culture are being, removed. So like the film and reality become an extension of one another. It means that they are the same thing, and so the culture industry wants to do the same with everyday experience. Our everyday experience must never be in tension with one another, and certainly not with the culture industry. And so everything that you consume and buy, you must see it as a continuation of your everyday existence, and likewise your everyday existence must be a continuation of the products that you consume. And so leisure and work are a continuation of one another. Cinema and reality are a continuation of one another. Nature and culture are a continuation of one another, and the continuation between leisure and work is also the continuation of cinema and reality, and that of nature and culture. So each opposite becomes the other, never allowed to be itself, right? And so what is repeated routine, which is what we do in society, becomes the same as nature. Whatever it is we keep doing again and again for no reason, mindlessly, must be accepted like we accept nature. Quote, "The paradox of routine, travestied as nature, is detectable in every utterance of the culture industry, and in many is quite blatant." So the end result would therefore be the deculturalization of human beings. Culture no longer exists, actually. What was supposed to allow us to transcend nature is now seen as the product of the same nature. Culture is supposed to make us transcend nature, but culture now becomes the continuation of nature, and nature becomes the continuation of culture. And so nothing therefore would distinguish between high culture and low culture, since even these two will be the continuation of one another. You cannot say, for example, that Beethoven is superior to jazz, while jazz musician can have the feeling of superiority once he adapts Beethoven to jazz music, like he plays with a triumphant smile, that Beethoven is not above jazz. And so for Adorno, again, this is Adorno's views on jazz, and I don't necessarily agree with him. If you are a jazz musician or a jazz enthusiast, and you are watching this, don't worry, Adorno is wrong about jazz, but his overall criticism regarding sameness is on the point. So for Adorno, hearing a jazz adaptation of Beethoven is barbarism. There is no respect for culture anymore when you call jazz culture, and yes, you can call that style if you want. You can say that there is technique in jazz, but barbarism isn't about having a technique, but about the extent to which you try to reach unity. Like for Adorno, barbarism is the insistence on unity. It's not the lack of unity, it's the insistence to reach it. And Adorno ends this paragraph from a quote from Nietzsche, who shared a similar view about this naturalness, this new style of doing culture. Quote, "A system of non-culture to which one might even concede a certain unity of style if it made any sense to speak of a stylized barbarism." So obviously for Adorno and Horkheimer, novelty and creativity isn't about breaking rules, since that is done and even more promoted by the culture industry, than to stick to the old-fashioned tradition or high versus low culture. Rather, culture industry encourages the break of rules as long as the breaking of those rules is safe. Like, Odysseus with the sirens. Sure, he breaks the rule, he listens to the sirens, but from a safe distance. He breaks the rules as long as he is tied to the same system that he claims to break free from. And so teachers, for example, will encourage you to be innovative as long as your innovation can be graded. Like, do whatever you want, but the system of classification stays and still determines you and the worth of your work. And so the freedom given to artists and performers becomes a more efficient tool to control them and conform them to the system. As they say, the general influence of this stylization may already be more binding than the official rules and prohibitions. So they gave the examples of how a music hit gets success, even though it doesn't respect the 32 bars, just like it won't get success if it puts, in the most articulated detail in terms of melody that doesn't figure into the standard of the culture industry. They also mention Orson Welles in cinema. He's the guy that made, the cult film Citizen Kane, and he took risks and he came up with novelties in cinema, but because those risks paid off in terms of revenue, his eccentricities were forgiven by the culture industry regardless of his artistic contribution. And so what matters for the industry is to prove that its system works, that there is nothing better than itself. Like, like the grading system. No one cares about your ideas. They care about how to grade them than to whether or not your ideas are good, or if your ideas are appreciated. So the more we invent new things, the more we bend rules, the more we come up with with new ideas, the more we transgress rule. It's just a pretext to make the already current system more potent. So we don't make movies and music to emancipate humanity, to bring actual new ways of thinking and existing. No, we make new things so that the system gets more validity and strength. Like enlightenment, like we said, works in a totalizing way. Whenever you try to justify something, you must do it with the standards of enlightenment. So whenever you want to justify your artistic choices, they must be justified within the standards of the industry. And so in other words, everything must rely on expertise. You want to make a movie, the producer is the expert that you have to convince. They must be certain that your ideas will result in a box office, and as such you need to make sure that your new ideas are from the start cliches, a guaranteed success. So you have to point that many other movies did it and it worked, and if the producer acts like they are not agent of the industry, they'll be like, I don't want cliches. But as soon as you give them an idea that is not a cliche, they will see the risk. They will see the risk coming, and so they'll be like, I want you to give me something familiar, but not too familiar, right? And so you end up having to appeal to the cliches of exceptions. Like, that one time they made a movie that everyone was sure it won't work and it was successful. Like, if my idea works, you'll make tons of money, like, those guys, or stuff like that. Like experts, because they claim that they know how things work in the real world, because they are the realists, they decide what's valid and what isn't based on nothing else but their own interests. They want to make more of what is already here, and that's the point of enlightenment, more than what is already here. So they don't care about the value of contribution, the contribution of art. There is no distinction between genuine and artificial art for them. There is just productive art and unproductive art. There is an art that makes money and one that makes superstitions. And by artificial art, Adorno and Horkheimer mean a style might possibly be called artificial if it had been imposed from outside against the resistance of the intrinsic tendencies of form. So a work of art for Adorno and Horkheimer is something that is alive. It is something that exists on its own, that is autonomous. It has its own individuality, and it doesn't bow to the desires of the artists, let's say. It can express the artist's emotions and desires for sure, but it's not confined to them. The form of artworks has therefore its own tendencies, like with magic. As such, work of art is artificial if these intrinsic tendencies were denied in its form. If a work of art only conveys the ideas or emotions of the artists, even if there is no pressure on the artist from a patron or a studio, it is still artificial. But the culture industry imposes even the content, even the subject matter of the art. It's just the form that is crushed. It's not just the form that is crushed, it's even the content, even the raison d'être of art. Its own autonomy is rendered inoffensive and invisible. The tension within the work of art, which illustrates its autonomy, is taken away and given to the experts. The focus is more about how the specialists, the experts, deliberate about the art. They become the center of attention, like again on talent shows. Nothing makes the viewer go wilder than disagreement among the judges. They become the center of attention, the main event of the show. It wasn't the singing or the dancing that happened on stage. No, the public simply watches. They simply do their work. They buy their tickets. They remain seated so that the camera guy does his job. And so by sitting at a talent show, the spectators are like rowing the boats, like with the story between Odysseus and the sirens. The spectators are, they are the crewmates of Odysseus. They are just, rowing the boats, while the judges, from their safe distance, they can watch and judge the art. And so every talent show is basically a reenactment of the myth of the sirens and Odysseus. The judges, they disagree, they get into fights with each other, like Odysseus, who tries to untie himself. The tension is presented as being within Odysseus, between the judges, and not in the songs of the sirens. By giving that tension, the source of autonomy to the judges, the culture industry is now, safe. As they write, the reputation of the specialist, in which a last residue of actual autonomy still occasionally finds refuge, collides with the business policy of the church or the industrial combine producing the culture commodity. So, in other words, the specialist is safe for the industry, because they have been trained in judging everything from the point of view of the industry, from from even before witnessing the work of art. The judge already knows what to do. He knows how to keep the show going, how to make more views, and so every single possible reaction to the work of art has been carefully thought about. Disgust, indifference, enthusiasm, even surprise and wonder have all been already staged. So there is nothing new that can happen on a talent show that the judges weren't already prepared for. And as such, every piece of art already arrives on stage as a commodity, as something to make the buzz, an advert for the entertainment industry, if you want. So it's like when you know that a novel is good because it was adapted to a film. A novel that is likely to be a bestseller is also a movie that has everything to be turned. It's also a novel that has everything to be turned into a movie. So the culture industry basically makes it so that when you write a novel, for example, you do it like a technician. Like every scene that you write it while asking yourself, how good would it be as a movie? And Adorno mentions a specific example. He talks about the film producer Daryl Zanuck, I think that's how it is pronounced. He's the co-founder of 20th Century Picture. In 1943, he produced the movie The Song of Bernadette, which is an adaptation of a novel by France Werfel, and it's about the story of Bernadette Soubirous, a French woman who claimed to have had visions of the Virgin Mary in 1858, and she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1933. So she was a big sensation, and Werfel wrote his novel in 1941 because, well, that was a subject certain to make it to the list of bestsellers, and it stayed #1 for 13 weeks. So it was just a matter of time before the novel turns into a movie and attract the attention of the right, companies. Quote, even before Zanuck acquired her, Saint Bernadette gleamed in the eye of her writer as an advert aimed at all the relevant consortia. To this, the impulses of form have been reduced. So, just like every artist goes on stage thinking about his big break, hoping to gleam in the eyes of the judges, like Bernadette gleamed in the eyes of Werfel and Zanuck. They are obliged to model their form to the standards of business. And so artists then indeed lose their style. All forms of styles are lost, but in the sense that they all dilute themselves into the standards of the culture industry. Now, it's not the style that makes the art. The style becomes irrelevant. What matters is whether or not that style made the box office hit. And so the tension that gives the worth value and the work its value and identity of the work. The tension that gives the work its worth, value, and identity, which is which is, in its style also, it is nullified. It becomes obsolete. So the tension is now giving to where there is actually no tension, where there is no style, where general and particular are confounded and confused, where opposites are one and the same, when even unity and opposition become the same. Quote, the extremes which touch have become a murky identity in which the general can replace the particular and vice versa. So this is to say that what have as style is actually a caricature of style, a stylized barbarism. Style is just a tool for sugarcoating things now, for example. You know when someone tries to tell you something offensive, but they use politically correct language to make the thing, pass through. Style is basically reduced to that. But then we have to ask, what about genuine style? Like, what is happening to it exactly with the culture industry? Well, about that they say the concept of genuine style becomes transparent in the culture industry as the aesthetic equivalent of power. So what is now genuine style is when your style allows you to gain power. Like, it becomes transparent in the sense that it is not at all in tension with power, with it or without it. The point of literature or music, films is the same thing, contributing more to power. So style is just an aesthetic equivalent to of power. You have power and then an aesthetic equivalent to it, which is style, and style is like the sugar coat of power. It tries to make power appealing, and this of course is something that came with Romanticism. Again, Romanticism sure gives some autonomy to details, but with the culture industry, that autonomy came with a price. For Romanticism, style is a merely aesthetic regularity. This is how they define it. This is how they define style in the context of Romanticism, a merely aesthetic regularity. And so this has a double meaning, or at least it's a double-edged sword, let's say. Let's start with the first meaning. Its purpose is to reproduce something obscure, to present an equivalent to it. Like for the Romantics, that thing is usually human suffering or the obscure experience of the subject. And so this suffering, which style tries to be an equivalent of, is precisely what Adorno and Horkheimer criticize in Romanticism. Romantics were looking for the perfect style, the flawless style that would finally capture their deep emotional suffering or emotional turmoil. They want that when you read their poetry or watch their plays, for example, you see and experience that deep, unfettered suffering that breaks all rules and boundaries. But this isn't what style is for. According to Adorno and Horkheimer, they say the great artists were never those whose work embodied style in its least fractured, most perfect form, but those who adapted style as a rigor to set against the chaotic expression of suffering as a negative truth. In the style of these works, expression took on the strength without which existence is dissipated, unheard. So, style for the authors is precisely what stands against that suffering. It should be very distinct from the chaos of suffering, and certainly not transparent to it. Art shouldn't be a transparent equivalent to suffering, like it shouldn't be one for power either. And so a total style, however, is precisely that. That's why they say that the greatest artists don't look for a perfect style, or at least, fractured style, which can also mean a style that is completely fractured. That would mean jazz. In the next sentence, they say that expression should take on strength, like style should embody strength, but because without it, existence would be impossible. In front of the unfettered suffering, existence would be impossible. It would dissipate itself unheard. No one can hear existence over the sound of suffering, for example. And the more style tries to be perfect and flawless, the more it becomes an equivalent to suffering. And so style for the great artists is actually a negative truth. When we are confronted to an artist's style, what we must be aware of is that the style in question is not the whole truth, but rather the style itself suggests that there is more to it than meets the eye. The style of the greatest artists negates itself, so to speak. It's basically the surface that positivism wants us to take as the whole reality. And so the first thing that you encounter in a poem, novel, painting, play, or film is the style. But being critical means that you don't stay on the surface level, right? When you hear a piece of Mozart, according to Adorno, you can perceive that there are tendencies that try to break from the style. So style is like the consciousness, and behind it there is the unconscious that is, leaking. This is why Adorno gives a contrast between Romanticism and the art of the Middle Ages and the art of the Renaissance. The style of the pre-Romantic eras, let's say, had sure a certain unity, but you can still find in the expression of the different you can still find in it the expression of the different classes of society. The social structures in tension are like the unconscious of society, and you can find it in the novels of Rabelais, for example, or the paintings of Bosch. They say the unity of style, not only of the Christian Middle Ages, but of the Renaissance, expresses the different structures of social coercion in those periods, not the obscure experience of the subjects in which the universal was locked away. And so this tendency kept on with artists like, Schoenberg and Picasso, who quote, up to Schoenberg and Picasso, great artists have been mistrustful of style, which at this decisive points has guided them less than the logic of the subject matter. So for style to be merely aesthetic regulation means that we have to be aware of its untruth. This is certainly something that can go to the credit of Romanticism, that style can never capture the depth of the subject matter, no matter how much it tries, and so Romanticism came with many tendencies to break style even further. So in this sense, Romanticism cannot be looking for the perfect style, right? But well, as we said many times with cliches, always be mistrustful of style can also become a cliche, and this is what Romanticism fell into. Like avoiding perfection is not safe from becoming totalizing as well. Like when someone tries to avoid perfection all the time, that too, can become the new perfection. Avoiding perfection is today's perfection. And so even the most mistrustful artists of style fell into this trap. Adorno and Horkheimer mentioned the Expressionists and the Dadaists. Now, Dadaists are perhaps the most chaotic of the bunch. They wanted style to be completely random as to express, its untruth. But as Adorno and Horkheimer say, what the Expressionists and Dadaists attacked in their polemics, the untruth of style as such, triumphs today in the vocal jargon of the crooner, in the adept grace of the film star, and even in the mastery of the photographic shot of a farm laborer's hovel. So this is the second meaning of the merely anesthetic regularity. It can be understood as a way to remind us that there are deeper things beyond style, but it can also mean that there is nothing other than style. Like style is an illusion, and there is nothing else but that illusion. And so the second meaning is that style as untruth, as illusion, becomes the totality. Like everything is like style. There are only illusions, only surfaces. Like there is nothing beyond, nothing beneath. And so this means that art is always about, a promise. Being an illusion, a lie, style can only promise truth. In every work of art, style is a promise. This promise of the work of art to create truth by impressing its unique contours on the socially transmitted forms is as necessary as it is hypocritical. And so this is similar to the liar paradox. When I say I am lying to you, if the sentence isn't true, like if I say I am lying while in reality I'm not lying, then this sentence is true. But if the sentence is true and I am actually lying, then because I'm lying, I am telling something that is not true. So in both cases, it is necessary and hypocritical. And so this is what makes the promise of style so paradoxical, because the promise of style does that. By admitting that it is an illusion, it both tells the truth and lies at the same time. So we have two opposites that are forced to be reconciled with one another, despite the fact that in the previous essay, Adorno and Horkheimer identified the law of non-contradiction as the basis of enlightenment. And so this is the situation in which we are. It's all about indecisiveness. We are hanged, suspended between Scylla and Charybdis. The reconciliation of particular and universal therefore legitimizes the social order. And so the social order, based on the promise of style, can claim that it is truly democratic because it reconciled everything. And so this is like an infinite Tsukuyomi, reference to the manga Naruto. Everyone gets to live their own little dream now, as they stay, asleep within the giant tree that feeds of their chakra, of their life energy. And so the social order becomes the absolute. It works in the same way. So art, under the influence of the culture industry, becomes ideology, propaganda, unfettered expression of power, but it doesn't mean that true art doesn't need style. As we said with the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, style is necessary because it is the strength that stands in the face of suffering. But it doesn't mean that style must not express that suffering. On the contrary, that suffering must be expressed in style. But what Adorno and Horkheimer are criticizing is when style becomes a mere equivalent to that suffering or that power. So it's undeniable that style has to reveal its untruth and transcend reality, but style shouldn't overshadow what makes reality, well, reality. As they say, the moment in the work of art by which it transcends reality cannot indeed be severed from style. That moment, however, does not consist in achieving harmony, in the questionable unity of form and content, inner and outer, individual and society, but in those traits in which the discrepancy emerges, in the necessary failure of the passionate striving for identity. So, for Adorno and Horkheimer, what makes reality is the discrepancies between its constituents. When you try to achieve harmony, the cost is that the tension between the things that make reality disappear, and once those things, once that tension disappears, it's reality that that you kiss goodbye. So a unified style is a style in which everything gets override with sameness. If what makes that tension is the differences and the particularities of individuals, the only way to have harmony is to make everyone and everything the same. That's exactly what the culture industry does. But it doesn't work like that. The culture industry tries so relentlessly to make everything have an identity designed for it. But individuality is precisely the failure of the passionate striving for identity. It is found in the tension that we experience. Like identity is, individuality, is found in the tension that we experience either within ourselves or with the world outside of us. And these two are also in tension with one another. Identity can only be obtained by the admission of this failure. And so this is a very Nietzschean way of looking at identity. Like the greatest works of art are not after identity, but about the suffering of a perpetual quest towards it, whereas, the lower forms of art, they are just, desperate about having an identity. And so in the process, they end up identifying as everything else, but never themselves. It's like, one thrives on the struggle while the other simply imitates the latest fashion or trend. So being unable to come to terms with the fact that there is no such thing as a fixed identity, you end up being a copy. Which again, even when you say there is no fixed identity, doesn't mean that you are not a copy as well. But that is the main distinction between high art and lower art. Higher art exposes itself to this failure of identity, while the low art, quote, instead of exposing itself to this failure, in which the style of the great work of art has always negated itself, the inferior work has relied on its similarity to others, the surrogate of identity. The culture industry has finally posited this imitation as absolute. So the culture industry is when everyone tries to be like everyone, when everyone imitates in this absolute way. That's what happens when everything, becomes about style. Being nothing other than style, it divulges style's secret, obedience to the social hierarchy. So that's what style is actually telling us, that we have to obey the social hierarchy. This is what we meant by transparency, that style is equivalent to power because it is the same as obedience to the social hierarchy. When everything just becomes a matter of style, well, you are just obeying the social hierarchy. So stylistic is just a process, like, workers leaving and entering the factory. Culture for the culture industry looks at people like a writer looks at style, literary devices that make the story run. The economy is the story, people are the devices, and so they have to be arranged in a way, in such a way like, style does. So culture itself becomes just style. The intellectual is just a bunch of literary devices that must be arranged in a way to allow for the smooth running of the economy. Culture is just that. Culture is just the production of the most efficient style, of the most efficient way of arranging things so that you get the best results. So when intellect simply becomes a matter of style. I meant the intellect. When I said the intellectual, I meant the intellect. So when the intellect simply becomes a matter of style, it regresses. It becomes nothing more but a sensory stimulus. Like style with the use of metaphors and all figures of speech just creates a sensation, but those are surfaces without breaches. By maintaining intellectual production just to a stimulation of the senses, the culture industry denies the emancipatory power and purpose of culture. It turns people into nothing more than cogs to run the machines, too dumb to even think about anything else but their assigned roles and identities. So the culture industry, in this sense, makes leisure toxic. Leisure is the time supposedly used for cultivating the mind when we are out of work, but the culture industry makes sure that human beings stay in the animal state when they leave work. Like leisure becomes like work. It is like work. It's about the same routine you experience on the machines and in the office. You must never, find the slightest opportunity to think, imagine, or dream. Hence, the culture industry achieves the unity of culture. Quote, only by subordinating all branches of intellectual production equally to the single purpose of imposing on the senses of human beings from the time they leave the factory in the evening to the time they clock on in the morning, the imprint of the work routine which they must sustain throughout the day, does this culture mockingly fulfill the notion of a unified culture which the philosophers of the individual personality held out against mass culture. So in short, the culture industry, the culture of the culture industry is just, anti-culture. It destroys the grains of culture by turning the purpose of culture into purely administrative functions. in its quest to make, culture inoffensive and safe, to turn culture into political correctness, the culture industry manages to do what intellectuals were very afraid of, the disintegration of culture and the rise of barbarism. Like philosophers and intellectuals, ever since the early days of culture, were hoping to achieve a unified culture that would be opposed to mass culture, which they saw as vulgar and unrefined. But the culture industry was able to bring about this unified culture, except it was a monkey paw. Like, be careful what you wish for, because a unified culture doesn't mean what Plato thought it would mean. A unified culture means the destruction of culture, the destruction of the intellectual formations that philosophers and artists spent so much time to build. So in this sense, since all cultures always talk about this hope of being unified, all cultures have within them the grains for their own dissolution. And so the main point of Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry is that every culture has the potential to turn into a culture industry, to become simple administration that organize life in a homogeneous way from which, there is no escape. Quote, to speak about culture always went against the grain of culture. The general designation culture already contains virtually the process of identifying, cataloging, and classifying, which imports culture into the realm of administration. So all they need, what every culture needs to destroy itself and to regress, is just an industrial push. And that's it for this second section of the culture industry. Next time we are going to look at the third section of the culture industry, and hopefully you enjoyed this video and find this useful for better understanding the philosophical concepts and reading the philosophical texts. Don't hesitate to push that subscribe button, to like, and to leave a comment. And thank you for watching, as always.